All right, everybody. So, where we left off was looking at the cumulative risk hypothesis, having to do with how we understand how risk factors can impact the way that we develop a specific psychological or social issue. So, what the cumulative risk hypothesis says is that basically, when risk factors accumulate, when they add up, the likelihood that a person will develop an issue or a problem starts to increase dramatically. So what we know is that there are some risk factors that are permanent parts of who we are. We can't change them, but other parts can be changed. So what we try to do in community psychology is understand, again, the severity of certain risk factors and if they can be changed, how we can change them, etc. Because of course we want to lower risk factors and increase those protective factors, always. Now, the study that you heard me refer to in part 1 of the week 4 lesson cited this long-term study that was done in Hawaii. So it began in 1955 and continued until 1995. And what the researcher and her team did was they followed almost 700 kids who were born in 1955 and documented, very carefully the different kinds of risk factors that they had in their lives. And what they found was that 30% of the kids in the study had one or more risk factor in their lives. So again, these are going to be things like poverty, mental illness, addiction in the family, low level of education, etc. Now they found that 2/3 of the kids who had 4 or more risk factors right from childhood, right from being a baby, right, that they were seriously more likely that they developed serious problems very quickly before adulthood. And so what this study was, it's very strong evidence for that cumulative risk hypothesis, that as our risk factors increase, so too does the likelihood that we will develop a psychological issue. Now it's interesting though, right, because 70% of these kids, right, 2/3 of the kids developed serious problems, but 1/3 didn't, right? A full 30% of the children with 4 or more risk factors did not develop serious problems. And according to the study, they became competent, confident, and caring adults. So what was going on for this small group of kids, the 30% of these kids with 4 or more risk factors? Well, what the researcher and her team really believed and documented was happening for these kids was that the protective factors were supporting them in not going on to develop serious issues down the road, and that they were developing and demonstrating resiliency. Now, resiliency is this topic that we're really interested in psychology. Basically, it's our ability to overcome a difficult, negative, adverse situation or condition and go on to experience healthy development, healthy choices, to not develop these psychological and social problems that we are studying in our course. Now, again, there are lots of different factors associated with resiliency. So again, it could be individual differences, things like cognitive abilities, self-esteem, impulse control, having a positive outlook on life. There could also be microsystem and community and organizational factors as well. Things like the type of family you come from, having close relationships with positive adults in your life, going to a good school, etc. So again, what we find is that these protective factors are associated with kids developing resiliency, and they act as a buffer, right? They're the bubble wrap that can protect people from experiencing the negative effects of all of these different risk factors that might be going on in their lives. Now, Albee in 1982, he talked a little bit about the qualities that he felt were very important to a positive intervention. So what they needed to do, according to Albee, was of course reduce or better manage perceived stress, that a good prevention program should reduce the negative impact of course, physically or biologically based vulnerabilities, help a person to develop their coping skills and social support and self-esteem. So this all sounds pretty good. Now, Elias in 1987 kind of went one further, right? Kind of built on what Albee was writing about and felt that strong prevention programs, again, needed to reduce or eliminate stressors and reduce physical risks, etc., improve socialization practices, increase social support, and opportunities for positive relatedness. So Albee and Elias's prevention strategies were similar. Now, one of the other related concepts that we're interested in community psychology when it comes to a prevention program is cost effectiveness. So how cost effective is this program? Because, these prevention programs are oftentimes quite expensive to implement with different groups of people. So we want to make sure that they're cost effective, but we also want to try to understand what that return on the investment is. And so in community psychology, we often will employ economists to help us understand how cost effective a prevention program is and how cost effective it might be in the future. So we might get somebody to do, a study looking at the broad economic impacts and benefits that a program can provide. Now, one of the things, these are very difficult studies to carry out, and I'm not going to go into, the math involved in it, but basically what we try to do is figure out, okay, what's the cost, right? How much did the program cost for every person who went through the program, and what was the benefit, right? What were the services that were not required for these people that went through the program because they went through the program? And then we kind of go one step further and we think about, okay, how did this person become a productive kind of member of society, right? Based on the skills that they were given from this particular program. What kinds of wages were they able to earn based on, all of the skills that they learned in this program? And then what were the taxes that they paid because they then became our, quote unquote, contributing member of society. So that's what we try to do in a cost-benefit analysis or a cost-effectiveness analysis. And just an example of one really powerful cost-effectiveness analysis that was done with a preschool project, so the High Scope Perry Preschool Project. What this project was, it was a prevention program designed for kids born into poverty. So this would be considered a secondary prevention program because it is being delivered to kids at risk. And the risk is that they were born into a situation that was not financially secure. So what the program did was it provided high quality, academically based daycare to kids born into poverty. Now, this analysis was completed when the participants were 40 years old. So the participants were followed for quite a long time. And it was found that for every $1 spent on the program, that the general public gained $12.90. So this is kind of one of the ways that we would do a cost-benefit analysis, right? So for every $1 spent on the program, and it was an expensive program, there's no bones about it, right? But it had a huge impact on the economic welfare and well-being of society. So some really interesting stuff there. So just a quick overview for what we talked about with Chapter 9. We looked at the concepts of prevention and promotion, and we talked about Kaplan's prevention model, so the primary, secondary, and tertiary forms of prevention. We revisited the concepts of incidence and prevalence and how important these statistics are for us to be able to understand how we can prevent specific issues from developing or from worsening in our society. We talked about the importance of risk factors and protective factors and resiliency and the cumulative risk hypothesis. We looked at the longitudinal study from Hawaii, and we talked a little bit about cost effectiveness analyses. All right, so some of my favorite stuff looking at prevention and promotion, prevention and health promotion. So what we're going to do next is talk about some specific programs for how we go about implementing these concepts and principles. So what Chapter 10 of your textbook does is it explores kind of the nuts and bolts of how we actually go about implementing these programs. And what we're going to do is a bit of a case study approach by reviewing some actual specific prevention programs that have done enormous amounts of good for different communities. So your textbook discusses some issues that are associated with implementing a prevention program. So I'm going to leave it up to you guys to go over these concepts. These are concepts, again, that are associated with how we would go about implementing a specific program. Just, factors to consider before we would implement a program, like, how's the program designed? How often are we going to offer it? What are the different components? How are we going to engage people, etc. Now, when it comes to different models of program implementation, there are a few different models that we look at. So one of the first models looks at, this concept of scaling up a program. So first, what we would do if we were implementing a prevention program is we would do some experimental development. We would test the effectiveness of the program in a small scale setting to get an idea of whether it works. We would then go on to, apply it in a more technical sense in a real world setting. Depending on how that goes, we would then move on to, sort of a bit more of a broader diffusion of the program. So maybe the program is going to be adopted by a whole organization or a community, and we're just going to keep testing it. We're going to keep making sure that it's working. And if it does, then the program is going to be implemented widely within, a culture or a community, etc. So this is the concept of scaling up, right? We start small. We start small with our experimental development. We're going to do a pilot test, and then we're just going to keep moving up and up and up until we implement it widely. A couple other models for you to be aware of. So we have one implementation model called the research to practice model, basically where a researcher or policymaker will push a community organization to adopt a program that the researcher or policymaker has found to be, evidence-based and good. So that's one way of doing things, but oftentimes the way that we find things work a little bit better is if a community can choose the type of program that works well for them, or if these two arms can work well together. So the community will ask for the different kinds of programs that, can help with the problems that they're facing, and then how to adopt them. So generally speaking, we see much better buy-in if a community can choose, have a little bit more say and choice in the types of programs that they can implement. This kind of goes without saying, right? This is all about that participation and collaboration value that's so important for us in community psychology. So that's where I'm going to leave you for your second installment of your Week 4 video tutorials for your Week 4 lesson on prevention and promotion. Stay tuned for your third installment where we're going to discuss some of the actual programs themselves. So some really cool initiatives that are being done in communities to help people with very serious issues. All right, see you soon.